The late 4th century BC, in an Athenian grove under the shaded colonnades of the Lyceum, a group of students follows a man as he strolls along and speaks. This is Aristotle, a brilliant polymath, whose very name in Greek means excellent or the best. But far from the dry character that one might picture of an old philosopher, Aristotle had plenty of his own personal quirks. According to one ancient biographer, he spoke with a slight lisp, and was quite conspicuous in his dress, even known for wearing fashionable rings. Yet when he opened his mouth to teach, that was where the real magic happened. Ideas changing the way that people thought about the world. In fact, in his lifetime, Aristotle even tutored a young Alexander the Great, and then returned to Athens to found his own school. He would lecture while walking about, earning his followers the nickname walkers or peripatetics. His teaching covered seemingly everything: logic, politics, ethics, physics, biology, art, essentially the sum of all knowledge available at the time. But how can we boil all this down into simple terms? What did he actually teach, in his own words and ideas? Well, Aristotle's surviving texts are mostly lecture notes and treatises, not polished essays for the public. They can be dense and detailed, but they do reveal a mind trying to systematically understand the world around it. Throughout these works, one can hear Aristotle's voice encouraging observation, critical reasoning, and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. In fact, he begins his Metaphysics with the simple declaration that all men, by nature, desire to know. Curiosity, in other words, is simply built into us. So today, we're going to explore Aristotle's actual teachings. We're going to try to not weigh it down with the fanciful words and all the jargon. We're going to build it up from a foundation. And by the end, from everything from logic, science, ethics, and art, I think we can understand together what Aristotle actually taught. Our goal is to walk alongside Aristotle himself in the Lyceum garden and see the world as his students might have. So bring with you your wonder, your critical questions, and most importantly, your sense of discovery. First, let me welcome you to the channel. It's going to be a bit of a longer one. If you've come here to fall asleep, well, you're probably going to. But if you've come here to learn about the philosophy, well, that's great. We're going to learn quite a lot about it today. I would like to thank the patrons for kindly supporting the channel, and I would like to thank those who checked out the merch store. Anybody who's new to the channel, drop a like and subscribe. And comments and all the rest always help the algorithm. Let's try to fill this platform with things like history and philosophy. Make a better world for everyone, don't you think? Now, enough of that. Let's get down to the topic at hand. Nice and relaxed. Slow, as always. Of course, it's a pretty good idea when we understand Aristotle's teachings, or at least attempt to do so, to try to understand the context in which he taught. Well, let's begin. Aristotle was born in 384, that is 384 BCE in Stagira, or BC for those inclined. Now, Stagira was a town in northern Greece. He came from a family of a medicinal background. His father was actually a court physician to the king of Macedon. This early exposure to biology and the natural world was perhaps what planted the seeds in Aristotle's later fascination with living things. Unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of information that's beyond the realm of conjecture about this time, But we do know that as a teenager, Aristotle went to Athens to study under Plato at the Academy. I'm sure you've heard of him. Plato was actually his mentor for about 20 years, and from Plato, Aristotle inherited a love of philosophy. But of course, he eventually developed his own approach. Plato had taught that beyond the mess of the physical world, there are perfect abstract forms. Let's think about things like a perfect justice, a perfect beauty, a perfect circle, etc., and that these eternal forms are more real than the changing world than we perceive. Aristotle, who was always the empiricist, managed to take a different view. You see, Aristotle believed the real world as we experience it is worth of study in its own right, and that forms or universals exist within things, not apart from them. One later report on Aristotle notes that in the work On the Soul, he outright says, quote, "Universal forms do not exist separately. Only particular things exist, and our abstract ideas come from them." While Aristotle, of course, respected Plato, in fact, he famously referred to Plato as a friend, but truth as a dearer friend, he was willing to depart from his teacher's theories in order to follow the own evidence that he had personally found. Of course, the entire method of Aristotle starts with observation, without any judgment, just pure observation. There is an ancient summary of his work that remarks as follows: "It is characteristic of Aristotle's philosophy not to ignore the visible phenomena." In practice, this means Aristotle collected information about the world tirelessly. When he later founded his school, the Lyceum in Athens, he and his students amassed a sort of early research library. Maps, specimens, descriptions of the constitutions of 158 different cities, among other treasures. And do remember that Greece was an amalgamation of city-states at this time. Now, there was even a tradition that Aristotle's most famous royal pupil, Alexander the Great, sent him exotic animals and plants from Asia so that Aristotle could study them. By all accounts, Aristotle took a keen empirical approach. Investigate, compare, and only then theorize. Despite this down-to-earth emphasis, Aristotle was not an anti-theory mind. In fact, he sought universal principles by which to organize the knowledge gained from observation. His approach was both inductive, that is, building general ideas from particular examples, and deductive, that is, deriving conclusions from first principles. He pioneered formal logic to aid in this process. Aristotle is often called the father of logic because he systematically defined the rules of correct reasoning. Even antiquity remembered this. An ancient biographical note credits Aristotle with the discovery of logic, distinguishing the patterns of syllogistic reasoning and something new in philosophy. For example, Aristotle taught how to form a valid syllogism, a logical argument with two premises and a conclusion. If we are going to make an example, say, all humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Things like this. Now, this logical toolkit, in its most basic sense, compiled in works known as the Organon, was Aristotle's way of ensuring clear thinking. He believed that knowledge had structure, and that by understanding logic, one could discern truths about the world in a more organized fashion. He also emphasized that knowledge must have sound foundations. In his Posterior Analytics, he explains that to truly know something, we must know its cause, and understand why that thing must be so. He wrote, "We do not have knowledge of a thing until we have grasped its why, that is to say, its cause." This reflects Aristotle's conviction that everything in nature has an explanation. It's the philosopher's job to find it. Of course, when we use this term nature, it is a broad, encompassing term, and do not think of nature just as the plants and trees, the rivers, the skies, things like this. We think about man's nature, the nature of morality, this kind of thing. This is what we're using this blanket term for. So while he urged this observation first, he always pushed further to ask simply why the thing is the way it is. And this habit of asking why led Aristotle to formulate a framework of causes that pervade his science and metaphysics. So let's start by explaining the four causes and scientific explanation. You see, one of his key teachings in his theory were these four causes, the four ways of explaining why a thing is. This was his answer to the question why in a comprehensive sense. If you had asked him why a statue exists, for example, he would say there are four different but complementary answers. The first being the material cause, that is, what a thing is made of. In the example of the statue, the material cause is the marble or bronze from which the statue has been carved from. This explains the substance underlying the object. And then we have the formal cause, that is, what shape or form a thing takes. It is the design, pattern, or the essence of the thing. For the statue, the formal cause is the shape of the sculpture, say the form of a human figure that the sculptor had envisioned. In living things, the formal cause is like the blueprint of a creature, which makes a cat, a dog, for instance, is its particular form or essence. Then we have the efficient cause, what made it, i.e. the source of the change or the agent. In our example, the efficient cause is the sculptor chiseling the statue, the immediate force or action that brings the statue into being. Aristotle often describes this as the mover or initiator of a process. For a child, the efficient cause is the parent. For a ball rolling, the efficient cause is the person who pushed the ball. And then we have the final cause. Why does it exist? In terms of its end or purpose. This is the goal or function of a thing. What is it for? We can say the rain is for watering the gardens. The air exists for its breathing. The light exists for our seeing. Things like this. For the statue example, the final cause might be to beautify a temple or to honor a god, its intended purpose. In nature, the final cause is akin to the organism's purpose, or the reason something is done. For example, the eye would exist for the sake of seeing. Vision is the eye's final cause. So these four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, are the central things to what Aristotle taught in both science and philosophy. Unlike modern usage, Aristotle's idea of cause is quite broad. It's an explanation, not just a cause and effect in a narrow sense. So when Aristotle explained natural phenomena, he often identified all four aspects. Take a living organism. Materially, it's made of flesh and bone. Formally, it's come from a certain structure, that is, a dog's anatomy and dog essence. Efficiently, it came from parent dogs, and finally, it lives in order to thrive and reproduce, that being its biological purpose. Now, using this four-cause lens, Aristotle systematically analyzed everything from physics to biology. It's important to note that Aristotle saw a special importance in final causes or purposes, especially in the realm of biology. In his view, saying that birds have wings isn't enough. One should probably add birds have wings in order to fly, that causal effect of having wings. This teleological or purpose-driven way of thinking is one way Aristotle differed from some earlier thinkers who might describe only the material or mechanical aspect of things. Aristotle argued that nature, like human art, does nothing randomly. Everything tends towards some end or fulfills some function. As he put it, nature does nothing without purpose. While modern science sometimes shies away from speaking about purpose in nature, Aristotle found it a useful explanatory concept. He taught that understanding a thing's function or goal is essential to truly knowing it. Hand in hand with this idea of causes, Aristotle also taught his students a framework for the organization of knowledge itself. He delineated different fields of study and insisted on approaching each one appropriately. For instance, in works on logic and epistemology, such as the work Posterior Analytics, he describes how we come to know things in certain stages. You see, according to him, our knowledge starts from sensory perception. We see the world, we hear the world, we touch the world. From repeated perceptions, we form memories, and from accumulated memories, we develop experience. It is then, with intellect, we abstract general principles and truths. Aristotle illustrated this in the Metaphysics. Animals have sensation, some animals remember, but humans can also convert memory into experience, and from experience draw universal knowledge, or even art. He saw human beings as uniquely capable of moving from the particular to the general. For example, noticing that a certain herbal remedy helped several sick people, that is the particulars, and then concluding a general medicinal rule. Aristotle explains, art arises when from many instances of experience, one universal judgment about a class of objects is produced. In other words, we grasp a principle, like a medical treatment that works for all patients of a type, only after seeing enough cases. This was a lesson in method. Aristotle taught that knowledge is built step by step, grounded in observation, but aiming at general truths. Aristotle's logical works, that being on interpretation, posterior analytics, prior analytics, categories, probably topics as well, yeah. A few more minor works. Well, they were essentially textbooks for clear thinking. He classified propositions, studied how arguments fail or succeed, and set out rules for valid inference. One key contribution was his theory of the syllogism, the structured deductive argument. For example, all mammals are warm-blooded, all whales are mammal, therefore all whales are warm-blooded. Aristotle showed why such arguments are reliable, and how a series of syllogisms could build up a chain of reasoning. This formal approach to logic was unprecedented. The early biographer, Ptolemy, notes admiringly that Aristotle, quote, distinguished the methods of syllogism, and thereby essentially invented the field of logic. And well, for a philosopher, having the title of being the one who effectively invented the field of logic, well, that's quite a title to hold, isn't it? But Aristotle also recognized that logic itself had its limits. He taught that different subjects require different levels of precision. In ethics or politics, for instance, one cannot expect the same certainty as in mathematics. This is because human affairs are variable. Aristotle cautions students that we must demand only as much precision as the subject allows. A very practical piece of pedagogical advice, certainly. He was basically warning against oversimplification. One shouldn't treat ethical reasoning like a geometry proof, nor should one apply moral sentiments to empirical science. Think about it this way. Each domain of knowledge has to have its own appropriate method. What's going to work in mathematics is not going to work in morality. And there was another aspect of Aristotle's teaching on knowledge. It was his classification of the sciences. He divided knowledge into theoretical science like physics, metaphysics, and mathematics aimed at truth for its own sake, practical sciences such as ethics, politics aimed at good action, and productive knowledge, that is, crafts and arts, all aimed at creating things. This is a triad of knowledge, this triad of doing and making. Those three methods cover the spectrum of human intellectual activity. Humans know, they do, and they make. Therefore, could you ask yourself, if a human does not know, does not do, and does not make, according to Aristotelian questioning, is it really a human? Well, either way, by categorizing knowledge in this way, Aristotle gave students a map of learning. But you shouldn't confuse, say, the study of nature with the exercise of political decision-making, even if both involve the same deductive reasoning, because each one of those fields has its own logic, its own aims, and its first principles. Well, all that being said and explained the best way we can, let's move on to nature and metaphysics, substance and change. When Aristotle turned to nature, that is physis, basically what we call science, he taught in great detail about physics, cosmology, and biology. A recurring theme in his teaching is the analysis of change and substance. Unlike his teacher Plato, who was fascinated by unchanging ideals, Aristotle was fascinated by how things transform, and yet retain an identity of their own. For Aristotle, the fundamental reality is the individual substance, an individual thing like, well, let's say a particular tree, a particular cat, a particular human, perhaps. Each substance is a combination of matter and form. Now this is called hylomorphism, from hyla or hyla, meaning matter, and morphe, meaning form. Aristotle taught that we should think of any object in terms of what it is made of, its matter, and what shape or essence it has, its form. For example, a clay statue is clay matter organized in the form of a figure. The matter by itself isn't the full reality. That being said, a lump of clay, that is not a statue. And the form by itself isn't a full reality either. The shape must be embodied in some matter. Reality, for Aristotle, is always formed matter, the two aspects intertwined. Now, this matter-form framework allowed Aristotle to explain change. When something changes, say wood burns to ash, or a child grows into an adult, Aristotle would describe it as the matter taking on or losing a form. To him, change never meant total annihilation or creation from nothing, rather something persistent. Matter, or underlying substratum, takes on a new form. In his work Physics, Aristotle identifies different types of change. Changes in quality, quantity, place, and substance. A substantial change is when something truly new comes. For example, a seed turning into a plant. Through all changes, however, some aspect remains continuous, the matter or potential that can become something else, and some aspect is new, the form, an actual state achieved. Think about water becoming ice, things like this. Or perhaps vapor, the same thing just in a different form. Now this sounds pretty abstract, I know, but Aristotle used it to make sense of everything from natural growth to elemental transformations. It was his special way of saying, even when things appear and disappear, there is an intelligible process, some constant element, and some evolving element, rather than just pure chaos. Because we can't have that, can't we? In teaching about nature, Aristotle famously added a fifth element to the traditional four elements of Greek thought, that being earth, water, air, and fire. Observing the heavens, he concluded that celestial bodies, that being the moon, sun, and stars, must be made of a different, unchanging substance, since they move in perfect circles and don't really seem to decay. He called this fifth element ether, or quintessence. So, for Aristotle, the sublunary world below the moon, this is made of mixtures of earth, water, air, and fire constantly changing and interacting with one another. The supralunary world, that is beyond the moon, is made of ether and is eternal and unchanging, stars and planets embedded in crystalline spheres. This cosmology might sound a bit odd today, but it was just his attempt to explain the differing behavior of earthly versus heavenly bodies, and for the time it was very, very advanced. It was a teaching that endured for centuries, though. Medieval scholars, for instance, adopted the Aristotelian cosmos of Earth at the center, encircled by the moon, planets, and fixed stars in their ethereal spheres. At the pinnacle of Aristotle's natural philosophy, it comes from his concept of the unmoved mover. In pondering what ultimately causes the eternal motion of the heavens, Aristotle posited that there must be a prime cause that itself is unmoved, a timeless, immaterial source of all motion. In the 8th book of Physics and the 7th book of Metaphysics, he describes this unmoved mover as a pure actuality that moves other things not by physical pushing, but the way a beloved object of desire moves a lover as a final cause by attraction. This idea doubled as Aristotle's notion of the divine, the perfect, eternal intellect, contemplating only the highest thing, which is itself, while abstract Aristotle's unmoved mover teaching aimed to answer the basic question his students surely were wondering about, and that is, what is the first cause of everything? A pretty old question. People are still asking that one these days, aren't they? Well, Aristotle's answer was not a creation story, but it was a philosophical principle, an ultimate rational explanation for the motion and order we see in the cosmos. Crucially, Aristotle taught that even when searching for the ultimate causes, one must not leap to superstition or abandon observational facts. He balanced his metaphysical discussions with constant reference to evidence. One account of his philosophy emphasizes that Aristotle would give, quote, as evidence what the majority perceive when presenting his proofs. Now this means that he didn't hand-wave away common experience. He started from it, built his foundation from upon it. Let's give an example. When discussing why the earth is spherical, he noted observable facts, like the shadow on the moon during eclipses. When exploring biology, he grounded his claims in the animals and plants his students could see or dissect. Aristotle's metaphysics and physics were thus taught not as mystical doctrines, but as reasoned conclusions from the ground up. He encouraged students to trust their senses, but also to sift those sensations with intellect to reach the underlying truths. But if there is one area where Aristotle's empirical zeal really shines, it has to be biology. By all accounts, Aristotle was the first thinker to systematically study and classify animals. He had an almost, I suppose you can call it a childlike curiosity about living creatures, everything from bees and cuttlefish all the way up to elephants. At his school, the Lyceum, Aristotle reportedly examined over 500 species of animals, observing their anatomy and behavior, and he wrote extensive works about it too, such as The History of Animals, Parts of Animals, Generation of Animals, documenting everything that he could, how certain fish bear live young, how bees make honeycomb, and how the embryo of a chick develops inside an egg. That's how fish bear live young, by the way. Excuse me for misspeaking. Now, some of his observations were amazingly accurate. For instance, his descriptions of the arm-hooked mating of octopuses or the brood care of certain birds, but other claims were mistaken by modern standards. Let's give him a break. He was doing the best with what he could. But it is important, Aristotle was teaching by example that understanding life required patient observation and comparative analysis. And so he often sought patterns. Why do both birds and bats have wing-like structures? What function does each organ serve in different animals? He even dissected animals like marine creatures and perhaps some large mammals to learn internal structures, and all of this was radically new at the time. Nobody before him that we know of approached biology with such thoroughness. One concept Aristotle is known for in biology, and psychology by the way, is his idea of the soul, the psyche, which he defines as the form of a living body. Essentially, the life principle that makes an organism what it is. Unlike Plato, Aristotle did not teach the soul as a ghostly entity trapped in the body or something that migrates from one physical vehicle to the other. Instead, he saw soul and body as two aspects of one thing, like the shape of a wax seal and the wax itself. In his treatise On the Soul, also called De Anima, Aristotle explains that the soul is to the body as form is to matter. It's what organizes a living body, giving it life and abilities. He identified different levels of soul corresponding to different life forms. Plants have a nutritive soul that they can grow and metabolize. Animals have, in addition, a sensitive soul. They can perceive and move. And humans have, on top of those, a rational soul, the ability to think and reason. This hierarchy of life became a staple of Aristotelian teaching. It also fit with his teleological view. Each creature's soul equips it for a purpose. The bird's soul gives it instincts to build nests and the power of flight, and the human soul gives the capacity for language, thought, and society. And so Aristotle taught that studying the soul was part of studying nature. So even his psychology was empirical. For instance, he investigated the senses and asked how we see or hear. He theorized correctly that the eye has something like a lens, and that perception involves a medium like light or air transmitting form to the sense organ. In an era with no microscopes, his inferences were impressively reasoned. He also ventured explorations for memory, sleep, and dreams, treating them as a biological phenomena. The overall message to his students was that life's processes, from breathing or thinking, all have natural explanations. One did not need to invoke myth or pure divine magic to explain the workings of organisms. One could simply seek the mechanism or function behind them. There is a rather, I suppose we can call it a charming example of Aristotle's biological insight, and that's his discussion of maritime biology, or marine rather biology, on the island of Lesbos. It said that during a stay there, he and his colleague Theophrastus studied the lagoon's creatures. Aristotle described the hectocotyle arm of the octopus used in reproduction, and noted how cuttlefish have an internal bone-like structure, i.e., the cuttle bone. These fine details show up in his writings. Students learning from Aristotle would not just hear grand theories, but also concrete facts about the natural world, making the lessons vivid and grounded. It's pretty easy to imagine a lecture where Aristotle, holding a specimen or referring to a drawing, explains how a fish's gills allow it to breathe underwater, or why exactly a heart is located centrally in the body. He was teaching the importance of looking at things closely. In fact, he chided earlier philosophers for making sweeping statements about nature without doing the homework of observation, calling their approach akin to random punches thrown by untrained boxers. I'm sure that that critique was received well by the other philosophers at the time. In any case, Aristotle aimed to train the intellect with both empiricism, that is experience-based knowledge, and rational analysis. Now, of course, the realm of philosophy is not just about the natural sciences. We have to talk about ethics as well. Virtue. What is a good life? Well, Aristotle had his own ideas about this too. You certainly can't go past it. His work, Nicomachean Ethics, a work named either after his son Nicomachus or his father of the same name, by the way, Aristotle asked the big question, and that's, what is the good life for a human being? He taught that every art, inquiry, and action seeks some good, and there must be an ultimate good that we seek for its own sake. He identifies his highest good as eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as happiness or flourishing. It's kind of like a slow burn sort of happiness, you know? So Aristotle meant something a little bit deeper than this momentary happiness. You see, eudaimonia is living well, the fulfillment of a human life. It's not a fleeting mood, but a lasting state of being fully alive and fulfilled, a deep sense of happiness. Importantly, Aristotle argued that eudaimonia is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. It's something we can achieve by living virtuously over a lifetime, and not some gift that fortune simply drops in our lap at random. Central to his ethics is the concept of virtue arete, which for him means excellence of character. He taught that virtues are habits, or dispositions to act in the right way, cultivated by practice and guided by reason. Famously, Aristotle defined moral virtue as a mean between extremes. In his words, quote, "Virtue, then, is a settled disposition of the mind, consisting essentially in the observance of the mean relative to us, this being determined by principle, as the prudent man would determine it." Now, this doctrine of the mean does not mean a bland average of behavior, but finding the right balance in context. For example, courage is the virtue between the extremes of rashness, excess, and cowardice, deficiency. Generosity is the mean between prodigality, that is, spending recklessly, and being stingy. Aristotle carefully walked his students through many such examples. Temperance, that is, moderation, is a mean regarding pleasures of the body, Proper pride is a mean concerning one's honor and so forth. But what is mean or balanced depends on the situation and the person, which is why Aristotle says it's relative to us and must be decided as a wise person would decide in that case. Aristotle taught that virtues are acquired by habituation. We become just by doing just acts, brave by doing brave acts, much as one becomes a good piano player by practice or a good artist by practice. This was a very practical insight. Moral education is about training oneself to take pleasures in good behavior and be pained by bad behavior until virtuous action becomes second nature. But hold your horses. Virtue is not just a mindless habit. It requires using reason to navigate complex circumstance. Thus Aristotle held up the ideal of phronesis, or practical wisdom, which allows a person to discern the right course of action when principles conflict or situations are somewhat novel. The virtuous person, in Aristotle's teaching, is someone who has both the right dispositions partnered with the right judgment. But it might surprise a modern audience, quote unquote, that Aristotle's ethics are quite human-centered and flexible. He didn't lay down universal commandments or strict rules. Instead, he reasoned about the kinds of lives and actions that lead to genuine happiness. He recognized that context and moderation are key. For instance, truthfulness is a virtue, but the appropriate amount of frankness will differ if you're speaking to a friend or speaking to a hostile crowd. Too much honesty could be a vice of insensitivity. Too little of it becomes deceitful. This nuance is why Aristotle's ethics can feel very realistic and applicable. It's about cultivating character. So you generally don't hit the mean, the average, and do the right thing, rather than checking off a list of do's and don'ts. Another essential part of Aristotle's ethical teaching is his discussion of friendship, that is, philia. He devoted 2 whole books of the Nicomachean Ethics, that is, book 7 and book 8 and book 9 to friendship, which shows how important he thought it was in a good life. Aristotle taught that friendship is one of the greatest goods in life, and he distinguished types of friendships, those of utility based on mutual advantage, those of pleasure based on enjoyment of each other's company, and those of virtue based on mutual respect and goodness. The highest form, virtuous friendship, he described as 2 people who wished the good of the other for the other's own sake, share values, and help each other grow in virtue. To Aristotle, life is richer and more fulfilling with such friends. It's hard to disagree. No one would choose to live without friends, even if they had all of the other good things in the world. This emphasis on friendship adds a bit of a warm, human dimension to Aristotle's teaching. Ethics, they're not just about individual pursuits, but something that flourishes in community and relationships. Aristotle's ethics acknowledged the role of external goods and luck. He did believe virtue is the primary factor in happiness. A virtuous person will make the best of any situation. However, he was frank that severe misfortune can hurt one's ability to be happy. Quote from his work, "Happiness, then, is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, and it is something final and self-sufficient." Yet, he immediately adds that external goods are needed too. Adequate wealth, family, health, and even good looks, that can affect one's happiness. A person constantly buffeted by extreme poverty or tragic loss might not attain eudaimonia. through no fault of their own. Their circumstances are just too difficult. It's like trying to grow flowers in sand. That kind of thing. The conditions are just not ideal. Now, the sober recognition prevents Aristotle's teaching from being overly idealistic. It's grounded in how real life actually works. He encouraged virtuous living while understanding that chance and context certainly play their own roles in the outcome. Basically, he taught his students an ethical framework where the goal is a well-lived life of virtue, finding balance, guided by reason, and nurtured in friendship and community. It's a vision of ethics as an art of living, requiring judgment and practice. One can certainly imagine Aristotle in lecture asking his pupils to reflect on an example of virtues and vices in their own experience, or to sharpen their own moral insight. His approach was less about telling them what exactly to do in each scenario, and more about how to cultivate wisdom to figure that out themselves. So, let's get on to humans as political animals. We live in a society. Building on his ethics, Aristotle taught about politics, which he saw as closely intertwined with ethics. So if ethics is about the good of an individual, politics must be about the good of a community. In fact, Aristotle considered politics the master science in the practical realm, because a proper political arrangement creates the conditions for individuals to live good lives. Quite famously, he stated, "Man is by nature a political animal." What did he mean by that? Well, what he meant was human beings naturally form communities, the highest form being the city-state or polis, and that a fulfilled human life is one that is engaged in the civic life of a community. We are not solitary creatures. As much as people like to think that they are, well, everybody needs somebody every now and then. Perhaps there's exceptions, but it's very rare. We achieve our good in concert with others. And Aristotle pointed out that a person who is without a city-state, not by their own choice, is either a beast or a god, implying that living in a structured community is simply part of basic human nature. Unlike bees or ants, however, humans coordinate through rational speech and shared moral concepts like justice, ethics, things like this. This, Aristotle taught, is what makes our political communities unique from other animals. In his work, Politics, he examined different forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, polity, which he considered good forms, and their corrupted versions: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, the bad forms, where those in power govern for selfish ends. Aristotle's approach was empirical and comparative. He analyzed constitutions of many Greek city-states, data all gathered by his school, to see what worked well, and of course, what worked poorly. He made a conclusion that a mixed government, elements of democracy and oligarchy balanced, often worked out the best way, and that the stability of a polis depended on a large middle class to avoid the extreme rich-poor divide. Though he personally favored a form of polity with virtuous, moderate citizens at the helm, Aristotle's teachings on politics was certainly not a one-size-fits-all. He recognized that the best practical government might vary based on circumstance, and he discussed education and laws that would keep a polis healthy. One interesting and rather progressive idea that Aristotle taught is that the city exists for the sake of living well, rather than merely living. The polis isn't just a pact for survival or economic trade. It is there to enable citizens to pursue virtue and happiness in a higher sense. This ties politics directly to ethics. A good state, for Aristotle, actively cultivates virtue in its citizens through education and laws. However, Aristotle also had some views that clash with modern sensibilities. For example, he defended, with some unease, the institution of slavery as natural for some people, and he had a hierarchical view of society: free men as full citizens, women and slaves in subservient roles. Pretty common views in his era. Though, even then, they were not entirely uncontested. Well, of course, the modern reader, unquote, can look at these aspects and critique them. But we're not walking in the modern era. We're talking about what Aristotle said, and we have to acknowledge them without too much judgment. Well, what was his reasoning? Well, the reasoning that Aristotle had was that some people lacked the rational capacity for self-governance, and thus were natural slaves, a concept that we firmly reject today on certain grounds, but it shows that Aristotle was a man of his time in certain respects. Still, much of Aristotle's political teaching was keenly insightful. He advocated the rule of law, reason impartially applied, over the rule of individual whims, and he warned against the extremes of wealth and poverty as destabilizing influences. He stressed the importance of education in shaping virtuous citizens, and he emphasized that humans find their highest fulfillment in contributing to a community, a lesson as relevant now as it was back then. Politics, in Aristotle's lectures, it wasn't a dirty business to avoid. It was a noble endeavor to organize society for the common good. He even saw the household, the oikos, as a foundational unit, and discussed household management and economics in the old sense of managing the home as preliminaries to politics. All these teachings would prepare his students, some of whom, like Aristotle's former student Alexander, would become great leaders, to think about governance, not just in terms of power, but in terms of virtue and the human good. So, it's really worth noting how his life intersected with his teachings before we move on. He personally experienced the political upheaval and the tensions of his identity as a Macedonian in Athens. After Alexander the Great's death, anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens put Aristotle in danger due to his Macedonian connections. Well, rather than face prosecution as Socrates had, Aristotle fled Athens in 323 BC. He is said to have quipped that he left to prevent Athens from sinning twice against philosophy, the first sin being the execution of Socrates, of course. Well, even though Socrates technically executed himself, but, well, it's for another time, isn't it? This anecdote, whether uttered by Aristotle or attributed later, it shows how seriously Aristotle took the relationship between philosophy and the polis. It also shows him practicing a little bit of prudence, choosing exile over martyrdom. But he did die shortly after in exile. But his students in Athens, back in the Lyceum, continued under his successor, Theophrastus. Aristotle's political legacy, as with his philosophical one, would only grow in stature after his death. But hey, we're not done yet. Let's talk about art and rhetoric. Aristotle did not teach only about abstract philosophy and hard sciences. He was equally interested in art and communication. In his work Rhetoric, he analyzes the art of persuasion, and in his Poetics, he explores the art of poetry and drama. works showing another side of Aristotle's thought, attentive to language, storytelling, and the emotional effect on an audience. In the work Rhetoric, Aristotle defines rhetoric as the counterpart of dialectic. Now, what does he mean by this? Basically, it's a skill of reasoning aimed at persuasion, rather than a strict demonstration. He taught that rhetoric is not inherently bad or deceitful. Used properly, it's the art of finding the available means of persuasion in any given case. Aristotle identified three modes of persuasion that a speaker can appeal to. That is the logos, logical argument; ethos, the credibility or character of the speaker; and finally the pathos, the emotional state of the audience. A good speaker, he taught, weaves these together, presenting solid arguments, that logos, while appearing trustworthy and virtuous themselves, ethos, and engaging the listener's feelings appropriately, pathos. Aristotle systematically discussed how different audiences, like judges in court or citizens in an assembly, require their own approaches, and he even analyzed famous speeches to illustrate these points. Students learning rhetoric from Aristotle would gain very practical knowledge: how to construct a compelling argument, how to use examples, and enthymemes, a kind of rhetorical syllogism, and how to stir an audience without manipulating them unfairly. He essentially taught rhetoric as a necessary skill for anyone in public life, much as we teach public speaking and composition today. The Poetics is Aristotle's study of literary art, especially tragedy, those serious dramas performed on stage in ancient Greece. He asks the question, what makes a good tragedy? What elements do these stories have? In answering, he effectively founded literary theory. He taught that tragedy is an imitation of an action. By imitation, mimesis, he meant something like representation. He believed humans are naturally imitative creatures and learn by imitation from childhood, and that we take pleasure in imitations, even of things painful in real life, because we enjoy learning and contemplating such representations. And this was a remarkable insight. People can enjoy the sadness of a tragic play, because through art we find that meaning and recognition, and we can kind of ignore the raw emotion aspect of it. Aristotle broke tragedy into components: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song, and ranked plot as the most important. He taught that a good plot should have a beginning, middle, and end, with events following logically and inevitably, usually involving a reversal and recognition. For example, the hero falls from fortune and realizes some hard truths about their situation. All this is structured to evoke pity and fear, and through these emotions affect a catharsis, meaning a purification or purgation of those feelings in the audience. Exactly what Aristotle meant by catharsis has been debated for centuries, but in essence, he suggested that watching tragedy can be emotionally beneficial to the spectators, allowing them to experience and release intense feelings in a controlled environment. In fact, one of Aristotle's interesting teachings in the Poetics is his defense of poetry as philosophically valuable. Plato had famously criticized poets, and even wanted to exclude them from his ideal republic, seeing them as imitators of appearances who could corrupt the morality of people. Aristotle, however, argued that poetry, and of course by extension drama, can show universal truths in a way that history simply cannot. He wrote, "Poetry is more philosophical and more elevated than history, because history just recounts what happened, whereas poetry shows the kinds of things that could happen. It deals with universals, not particulars. This is a powerful argument for the importance of imagination and storytelling. Through well-crafted plots and characters, an audience learns about general human nature and ethics, perhaps more effectively than through abstract lessons. Aristotle was teaching that art has its own kind of knowledge and insight to offer. And so, in discussing epic poetry and tragedy, Aristotle also touched on the importance of unity and coherent theme, concepts that would influence literary criticism all the way up to our modern times. But he had a practical streak too. He advised that playwrights construct their plots in a way that if any part is removed or rearranged, the whole would be disturbed, anticipating what we'd call narrative integrity, I suppose. All these points show Aristotle applying his logical and empirical mindset to the realm of art. He observed many plays, identified patterns of success or failure, and drew general principles. A student in Aristotle's day, listening to his lectures on tragedy, might come away not only with a deeper appreciation of Euripides or Sophocles, but also with a sense of how art and psychology intersect. Well, as we reach the end, it's quite nuanced. In a single hour or a single treatise, one could only scratch the surface of what Aristotle really taught. The surviving works span logic, natural science, metaphysics, ethics, politics, aesthetics, rhetoric, and within each, they brim with detailed arguments and observations. But stepping back, we do see a unified vision. Aristotle taught his followers to seek understanding of the world in its fullness. He believed that the universe is a place of order and purpose, that human reason, if disciplined, can grasp why things are the way they are, and that knowledge and virtue go hand in hand, leading a fulfilling life. And I hope you're well and truly fulfilled by what you've listened to today. It's been interesting, hasn't it? Old Aristotle. Well, I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carey, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gukububonik. Still not sure if I'm saying that right. Well, that's it from me today, or tonight, whatever time you're listening from. And I think we can all go and have a little bit of a rest and meditate on what we've learned. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.